So good afternoon and welcome to this Agile Solutions and Informatica webinar. Today, we're talking about how data management culture is playing a key role in public sector and for public sector organizations when they want to realize their data potential. We've been talking about data management culture really for the last 18 months to 2 years about what it is, but during 2020, we've been focusing on industry-specific views of a data management culture, and today we're focusing on the public sector. Just quickly, let me introduce myself. My name's Andy Joss. I look after the business value and data governance business for Informatica in Europe and Middle East, and I'm joined today by Mel. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thanks, Andy. Hi, yes, I'm Melanie Parker, and I'm a principal consultant, and I look after data strategy and governance at Agile Solutions.
Fantastic, thanks. So I just wanted to start really first by putting a bit of context into what we're seeing happening in the public sector, because clearly it's been a very challenging time for all public sector agencies. And just thinking about where we are in terms of some of the current challenges, then clearly there are definite challenges around budgets, but also delivery of projects and programs. Many of those are under strain given the financial situation that we find ourselves in. And of course, given what's happening, demand has increased across many agencies for the services that they provide. And the NHS just being one very obvious example of that, but many others too. We're still dealing with the fact that we've got staff either working from home, or in some cases they have been furloughed. So we've got disparate staff, or maybe a reduction in working staff at the moment. And of course, we're trying to get people back to work, but actually, having a safe working environment, whether it be in the office or at home or in traveling, is still proving challenging for many organizations. And of course, many agencies are trying to work out, like many of the public, of course, when will normality return? When will we start to see some of the things that we're more traditionally used to? On top of that, of course, then we still have all the changes, the business as usual challenges that the public sector has, which is around ensuring that they get the best value for the service they deliver, thinking about what they do with the budgets they've got, but also in many cases, the costs that they have to live with. Of course, many of those costs are continuing to rise for obvious reasons. Thinking about the skills that they have in the workforce, do they have the right skills in the right places, particularly in this increasingly digitalized world. Also having to cope with technology change and specifically around areas like automation and what that means in terms of the service delivery, but also the way organizations are structured and run. And of course, many in the public sector see themselves as leading by example through these challenging times in terms of new technology or ways of working. So all of these challenges still exist, as well as the environmental challenges that we have currently. And of course, on top of that, the needs of citizens are changing too. And in some cases, they're very obvious changes, but actually in others, they're probably a little bit more subtle. And thinking about some of the shifts that we're seeing in these areas, also in thinking about how citizens spend their money for the services they get, thinking about how agencies deliver given the money that they've got, thinking about how to make the service delivery as cost effective as possible, given the most value as possible. And of course, then thinking about how to prioritize the big challenges which we're getting from our citizens. We also have, of course, disparities across the organizations in terms of what they do and how they do things. And of course, there's whole issues around the visibility improvements that people have around public sector. The NHS, of course, is just one organization which has had a massive improvement in its visibility, but many other agencies have too. So citizens are also driving change, and these shifts are obviously things that entities have to try and deal with. But actually, one of the common things that we see is many public sector entities are really struggling to respond or innovate fast enough. And that's to try and meet the needs either of the citizens they serve or the administrations that obviously govern what we do. And it's the ability to respond or innovate fast enough, which is driving many in the public sector to think about how they can better use data and drive something we call the data management culture to help them unlock the value of the data they've got to help drive these kind of changes. And actually doing so delivers potentially a whole bunch of significant benefits in terms of not just obvious things like operational efficiency, which hopefully would lead to cost reduction, but also thinking about how we can use data and data management culture to optimize the approach that agencies take, which hopefully will then give us better service delivery. Internally, but also externally, we can think about how we can use data to improve the processes and practices that we have in terms of optimizing the delivery. And of course, we always have to deal with public perception. And the better public perception we get, then actually the easier it usually becomes to get community buy-in for the things that we're trying to do. So there's a lot of upsides to doing this too. It's not all challenges. But actually, probably the biggest single thing we see is that the public sector is in the midst of a number of digital transformations, and it's all happening at different paces and in slightly different ways. But actually, maybe the current climate we're in could maybe accelerate some of this, given the challenges that we talked about earlier. So let's think about this thing we call data management culture, and what role does it have in helping the public sector address some of these challenges and potentially rise to some of the opportunities that come from it. Well, actually, data management culture is about ensuring that organizations manage their data effectively. It may sound very obvious, but actually many organizations struggle to do that. They may be very good at acquiring data or maybe very good at analyzing data, but actually the value of data only really comes when you've acquired it, but also when you manage it and govern it too. Now, on top of that, agencies and organizations, they're trying to find the right tactical and strategic balance between what they need to deliver with data sitting at the core. We'll also be looking at how organizations are tackling the competing priorities that they have, the constraints they have around skills and resources. Clearly, there's always going to be budgetary challenges. And we've also got to deal with things like collaboration, organization, and whether the change the business and the run the business model is working effectively. And as you can see here on the right-hand side, there's a number of projects and programs that center around data that organizations are busy trying to work with to ensure they deliver both tactical and strategic value for the organization. So data management culture really sits across much of this, and it's about how organizations think about the connection from the data strategy down to things like the data governance strategy and the data management strategies, but also up to the business strategy. But it's also then about how the organization is structured, the way things work, the way the organization responds to issues that they have, all in the end about bringing together the ability to have a good culture around data, and particularly around the management of data, so that organizations can unlock the value of the data they've got. Now, today, we're not going to go into this in detail because we did a lot of that last year. So if you go and have a look on the website where you found the registration link, you'll find more webinars talking more detail about what data management culture looks like. But today, we'll just give you that little bit of a highlight. And then thinking about the role that then this has in how public sector organizations are looking at how data can help as part of these tactical and strategic aspects that we're talking about. And what we're starting to see is that actually for many across the public sector, it's not just one or two or three, sometimes more of these areas. For many, of course, it's actually they're trying to deliver against all of these requirements and very often at the same time. And that's because of all the challenges and the opportunities that we talked about earlier. So thinking about all of this, then what we wanted to do today is to say, well, if we think about data management culture, then actually it's helpful to share examples of organizations who are on that journey. So today we're going to share a couple of examples with you. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to ask Mel to pick up and tell you what these organizations are doing around data and data management culture, and particularly around the value that data management culture is bringing to them. Mel, we'd like to pick up the story from here.
Sure. Thanks, Andy. Okay, so we do have a couple of client examples. So going back to what Andy's talking about around, how does data management culture sort of figure into very disparate type agencies, but at the same time do connect the dots in that space. So the first one that I'm going to talk about today is a central government department, so one that sits at that sort of top tier and feeds down in terms of policy and guidance and control. And the second case study that I'll talk about today is a regional police force that inevitably manages a large territorial area, and just really go into some of the complexities that in itself brings. So the first one that I'll go into today is around the large central government department. And unlike, or certainly like other businesses and certainly in private enterprise, the same business challenges exist. So we do have lots of legacy platforms. We have a very complicated and complex data landscape, which is organically growing over time. These are the services that have been born from different policy changes, etc., that are there to support citizens and services, whether they be traditional services or indeed new ones to support as we go through the digital age. Out of those very large number of legacy applications, obviously comes some workaround issues. They tend to see a lot of spreadsheet use, etc. So how do we get from this fragmented approach to data management into something that's a bit more standardized, contextualized, and is governed in a way that you'd expect? So some of the actual data management practices are often inconsistent. They are dated because they've been around for a long time, but they're certainly not sustainable as the data footprint grows within these institutions. Data quality has always been a sort of an issue, and in terms of trust, this keeps changing as well, because it's not just a one-point fix in terms of data quality. This has to be built into the practices going forward. So for this particular government department, there were 3 different campaigns around the capability that they knew that they had to implement. This was around business glossary, data catalogue, and of course, data quality management. Business glossary is around making sure you've got the right terms, the right data net definitions for more a business and application sense, rather than those technical and table definitions that tend to be around when accessing data sets. The centralised data catalogue, which will obviously help with the construct of that data from all of those legacy applications, just to try and make a bit of sense of what they are and where they come from. And of course, the data quality management is that additional data management capability that will help to derive any sort of gaps in those processes, and also ensure that we've got the right metrics and quality of information that's coming through at an analytical stage. So what sorts of culture outcomes and value from the government department can we see? So ultimately, they want to be able to transform customer service delivery. And in essence, this is really to help improve that citizen journey or that citizen experience from that outside-in approach. As Andy's talked about earlier today, of course, they want to increase operational efficiency, and it's essentially in those efficiency gains where some might just be light touch or small, but at a very larger enterprise view, that can be actually quite surmountable. We want to be able to provide the right data to the right people at the right time. This has always been the crux of the matter, and I think that really that's the idea, because we want to get to the point where we can make decisions at the right time with using the right data. I thought the next bullet point was actually quite interesting, because this is around how do we not just inspire trust through data quality, but actually thinking about the sort of ethical use of the data and the secure data usage. So already this isn't to do with just data compliance or data protection, but actually it's a wider gamut of data management. How is that culture going to support that? Through having built those data foundations, we hope that this is actually going to drive a much more innovative and data-driven culture by starting small and sort of growing out to the point where a lot of these other functional areas within the government can actually see the value in bringing it together. But it's not just the technology or the data management capabilities that will underpin this. I think the biggest thing is the recognition that you have to build your organisational structures to support it. And of course, by doing so, you will enable those strategic priorities. So if I move on then to the regional police force example. So this is obviously slightly different to the government example. Really what the challenges they were facing is the idea of they've got exponential growth of media. So a lot of data that's structured, of course, but actually a lot of unstructured content and media coming from things such as social media, devices, a lot of camera techniques, etc. This is why it's really important that we just don't look at data management as a sort of structured 0 and 1 kind of methodology, that we also ensure that our unstructured content is managed the same. They had an increased demand to exploit that data for various reasons, to make sure that, you know, if they were engaging with a member of the public once, that they haven't had to try and do it time and time again and take that data down twice. But they also had a lack of data ownership within the organisation, so they didn't really quite understand, you know, where the data was collected, where the data was stored, who actually owned the data at what point. So this in turn led to an increase in some compliance risks. Again, it wasn't to do with just the sort of hardback paper copies of the data or information or policies or handwritten notes, but to do with the fact that they knew that they were really bringing in a lot more structured and unstructured data. So how were they going to manage that? And of course, because of that complexity, there was a lot of lack of accountability around data decisions because they didn't really know which way that they had to structure themselves to manage this. The final thing was really around the ability to share relevant data, and this is really important for them around how do they get that sort of collaboration and working relationship with their partner agencies. And all of this obviously is to prevent and detect crime. So there's two things that we needed to look at to begin with before we went into the actual technology sets. And this was around their sort of wider target operating model and how this was then in turn going to help them achieve data governance. So the target operating model was really to really assess what kind of functional areas, what kind of culture, what kind of sort of data operations that this regional police force may need to think about and consider for the future, but also how do we get them to think about how they transition from the current world as it is today into that optimised version. So as a result of that, the target operating model was approved, and they started small and making those small changes with a view to bringing that into a bigger transformational piece. And by doing so, they can ensure that improving public contact, engagement and activity will really drive that trust that they're trying to get from the public. It's also a quality service experience for the citizens, as well as the same example of the government department. So that whole journey of ensuring that when you're engaging with the agency, that you don't have to submit your data twice, that you feel that you're being listened to and you feel that your information is being taken seriously. The ultimate aim of the Regional Police Force is really to make better use of the digital evidence and intelligence, and as more policies is devolved and deployed in that area, again, this is just another focus and priority for them. But again, the whole point is to reduce crime and improve crime detection, which is now a focus for them. So we could really look at this in two ways. So key takeaways can be classified into two different buckets, if you like. So the first one is all around the organisational and operational ideas, and the second one is around process and architecture. So from the operational side, what we find is that really you need to start to attract and grow data experts. Now, whether that's from within, through a series of training, learning, skills, data literacy, and embed them within your multidisciplinary teams across multiple functional areas. This will help to grow your data management culture as it's not siloed within distinct teams or just a few employees dotted across the business. By raising awareness and the expectations about the data, because we won't get all of this done on day one, it broadens those horizons to make sure that the applications are fit for purpose across the different areas. In order to drive those data innovations as well, you may have to consider both working internally with your peers, your colleagues, but also potentially with some external partners to bring in that much needed help. And when it comes to actual capabilities and data decision making, maybe address those potential data bias through education, data literacy and data ethics programs if we haven't already started them. From a process and architecture perspective, think about improving the timeliness and the quality of the underlying data and technical foundations, because I think a lot of the quality of the information will drive a lot of the architecture and the strategy around that piece. If you provide easily accessible, richer and more accurate metadata about your data assets, then this will help to not only enrich the data that you use, but provide a lot more context and a lot more history to the data than you might get from a sort of one dynamic viewpoint. But again, in terms of that, to support what I just said above around that organisation and operational context, the idea being is that we should be able to deliver those curated, self-service data points in order to put the power in the hands of the users, so that it's them that can make the better decisions in time to make a difference. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Mel. Fantastic. And it's great to hear a couple of real life examples. And clearly, as you can imagine, from a size and from a complexity viewpoint, these organizations are going to be quite different. And in terms of clearly of their remit, they'll also be quite different too. But it's great to hear how they're approaching what they're doing around improving their data management culture and the types of benefits and the outcomes that they're clearly looking to drive from it, or maybe are driving already. I just want to do a little bit of a summary, just to kind of pull all of this back together. And that's just to kind of refocus this back onto the concept of many public sector organizations are looking at areas of data management culture and data management culture per se to help them as they're starting to deliver across some of the requirements, either through the examples that Mel talked about or some of the ones that we talked about earlier. And clearly, whether it be around the classic ones of service delivery and operational efficiency, but of course these days we also have to think about things like talent management too. So across all of that, then we have an awful lot of opportunity and requirements, and data management culture has the potential to play a very significant role in how organizations are supporting their digital transformation journey, as data management culture really does provide a backbone to that. We've covered a lot today. We've gone through some really great examples, so thank you, Mel, for that. But we wanted just to share with you what's happening in the world of public sector, why data management culture is so important and it's so relevant right now, but also some of the potential benefits and the approaches that organizations are taking. Because the idea being is that if they're taking these things and they're getting benefit and advantage from it, well, potentially other agencies can do the same. I'm conscious that we just have a little bit of time left, and I think we've had a few questions come in, Mel, is that right?
Yes, sorry, Andy. Yeah, I think we've got 3 in total.
Okay, cool.
Okay, so if I start then. Yeah. Okay, the first question that's come in is, if good data management and governance benefits from establishing a system of shared values and skills, can you provide an example of where this is demonstrated or where you've seen it before?
Yes, that's a really, really good question, actually. So probably a very topical answer on that is Informatica is running a sister series of webinars called the Data Empowerment Expert Series. And actually, we did one fairly recently with the Driver Vehicle Standards Agency, obviously the agency responsible for making the roads safer in the UK. They spent time talking about their vision around data. They spent time talking about what value means to them, and about how they're getting organizational buy-in. They talked about the skills that they need, the capabilities they need, but more importantly about the types of values and outcomes that they're looking to deliver. And their data transformation program is very much focused on driving outcomes, because clearly as organizations, that's what it's really all about, materially impacting the positive outcomes. So I think that we've already seen a number of examples. The Driver Vehicle Standards Agency, or DVSA, I think is a good one, but there are others too. And a quick look on the Informatica website, for example, or the Agile Solutions website, will show some more examples. I've got one here for you, I think, Mel.
Okay.
Let me read the question. So it says, what conditions are needed to support sound data-driven decision-making within public sector organizations? That's quite a big question, I think.
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. I wouldn't say there's a right or wrong answer, but I certainly would support that the idea is that you have to come at this from a 3-pronged approach, really, which is that you have to have that right balance of that top-down approach where people are really sponsoring the fact that they're prepared to do decision-making using data and not just based on gut feel. But also to do that, they need to empower, obviously, those functional teams to support that to actually happen. So it goes back to my previous example around ensuring you've got the right organisational structure, whether that's necessary to start looking at things like data ops or data operations to support that, and also round about your own service delivery, so making sure your old traditional approaches are now starting to move towards that sort of self-service approach. It could be that the architecture needs to be thought about in terms of, you don't want to go necessarily to that full centralised approach. A federated model may suffice dependent on the conditions of how that public sector body or agency is being run. And there's certainly a lot of sound bites for the reasons for doing it differently. But also it really comes to the heart of the people that work for you in terms of those assets. So that data literacy and data ethics, it's making everyone accountable to some degree of the data that they use, the data that they collect, and really getting into that sort of culture of, you know, evidence-based, using information and data and always bringing it back to that point, again, so that it's timely and it's relevant, it's not out of date, and they can actually then start to see cause and effect and impact, which would mean that even the way in which they're suggesting the questions of what they're asking from the data will naturally change over time, whether that be KPI driven or otherwise. So I think it's very much making sure that you've got at least a good balance of all of those together.
And is that, do you think, you know, the example you were talking about earlier is about organizations having confidence or having trust in data? Is that what you're seeing, that this idea of having the sound data-driven decision making, is people having confidence and trust in the data to be able to get the outcomes they're looking for?
Absolutely, and you know, you're never going to get data 100% all of the time. I think it's the idea that you know it's about where the data is of insufficient quality, for example, that you've got those practices in place to remedy that, and show the impact and change over time. And by able to show what the real impact of the data makes on decisions, then it really drives that sort of business case and support for ensuring that you've got a much more rigorous approach around that. Yeah.
Cool.
Okay, I think the last question, Andy, is probably for you as well. Okay. And final question is, from a public sector perspective, we've seen a lot of focus on policy and compliance, probably GDPR, etc. Yep. So how can automation from technology, as well as the processes, help convert the citizen data into the citizen experience?
Oh, that's a really, really insightful question. I think there's a few things that we probably just need to touch on. I think automation as a capability thing, it's really important, because much of what we do, you know, from an agency or from a department viewpoint, you know, we spend time working with data, but in many cases the data can either be quite disparate from one another, maybe even operating in silos in some cases, and of course we have multi-agency working, in which case then we've now got, you know, data sitting across physically different entities, you know, with different standards and with different technologies and processes. So actually I think automation can help provide a link and a joining together of that data. And I think if we can start to do that, that's when we can start to think about a much more end-to-end experience for the consumer of that data. And sometimes it might be, you know, a very end user experience, maybe, you know, through an application or an app, getting access to, you know, to information in a self-service way, but in information coming from multiple places. If it's giving the citizens the information and the insights they need, but they are then in control of how they use that, then I think that's a really, really positive thing. I think also thinking about sometimes joining together, you know, different sets of data across organizations, or different sets of data within an organization, it can start to help us understand and reach out to people maybe who aren't necessarily quite as fortunate or able to kind of take the benefit of the end-to-end experience. So maybe it's telling us about people maybe who are vulnerable, or maybe who don't have access to the technology to kind of get some of the other types of benefits. So for me, I think, you know, automation about pulling data together, I think is a really important one. And I think the second part then is actually increasingly we're looking at, you know, some advanced technologies to help us bring insight into what's happening, you know, in our organizations, but also with our citizens and the communities that we look after. And increasingly we're seeing things like, you know, artificial intelligence, machine learning, you know, robotic process automation and other technologies coming to fore. The issue we've now got, of course, is that if we're going to use those technologies to get the best outcomes from them, we need to ensure that we have the best data that we're giving to them, either to train models, as in the AI machine learning world, or maybe just, you know, really good data if we're looking at making backward-looking analytics, let alone forward-looking analytics. So I think for me, the two big ones for automation is, one is about joining the data together to ensure that we can provide the end-to-end experience, and probably another key area is about providing the right, best quality data we can to other parts of the environment or tools which are going to help us make those better decisions and give us the better outcomes we're looking for.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I've just got one final question coming in from Adam. He would like to know if there's a balance to be had between being entirely data-driven, focused around decision-making, or whether there's a balance or a blend to be had with operational experience. And I think, given probably both of our answers earlier, we could imagine that with the rise of automation, there will be a lot of decision-making that will be done potentially in the future that really doesn't lend itself to traditional approaches that we do now. But I certainly think that at the moment that, yes, of course, there needs to be a balance between that operational side and the data-driven side, but that doesn't mean to say that your operational side can't be data-driven as well. Andy, do you want to expand?
Yeah, I think it's a really great question. And for me, I think what you're saying there, Mel, I think is absolutely spot on. I think the other aspect that just kind of thinking about what experience many of us have been through in the last sort of 6 to 9 months. Sometimes we don't have the data, or maybe we don't have the information. So sometimes we don't necessarily have as good a picture as we like, and therefore we're reliant on either maybe data that's not as good as we'd like, or the judgment of people. And this is a very human-centric world that we live in, clearly. So therefore, finding the right balance across all the different parts of the ecosystem, whether it be from a data viewpoint, from a process viewpoint, operational or consuming viewpoint, I think it's really important that we have all of that, and that we make sure that when we're looking at that balance, given we've got all that different amount of data, one of the key points you were talking about earlier around data ethics, ensuring that we're doing the right things with the data and making sure it's giving us the right kinds of representative outcomes. I think that's a really important point, how we pull that together. So yeah, I think finding a balance, I think, is really important. That's a little bit what we were talking about, with that kind of tactical and strategic balance that agencies are having to make.
Exactly, yeah.
Great, and thank you for the question, Adam. So we've run out of time, unfortunately, which is a really great shame, because clearly we could spend a lot more time talking about this. But for now, I'd just like to say thank you very much for your time. I'd like to say thanks very much, Mel, for your fantastic input again today. It's been really
no problem. Thank you.
For anybody interested, then there'll be a copy of the slides available afterwards. You'll also be able to get access to a recording of the webinar. So if you need to share it or play it back again, then please feel free to do so. If you go to the Agile Solutions website, you'll find not only information and recordings on data management culture in its broader sense, but what we've been talking about what it looks like, how it works, and maybe what's going on in some other industries for some best practice learnings, then the Agile Solutions website is a great source of information for you. So now, thank you very much once again. Hopefully you found this useful, and have a very great day.
Thank you.